Hello everyone, and welcome to the Vehicular Attack webinar for Region 2. My name is James Balakian, and I will be providing technical support for this webinar. You can communicate with me through the Q&A pod on your screen. If you have technical questions or questions for the speakers, please enter them into that pod, as all audience members are muted. We will be saving the Q&A portion for the end of the webinar. In addition, there will be a short survey at the end of the webinar, so please stay on. For more information about mass attacks in crowded and public spaces, please visit ready.gov/public-spaces. Now I will be turning it over to our moderator, Devin Kearns, the Individual and Community Preparedness Officer for Region 2. Thanks.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I have the honor of introducing our speaker today. This is the second webinar he's done for us, and I'll say that he's been our most popular webinar presenter so far. No pressure on you now, Steve. But Steve Crimando is the Director of Training for the Disaster and Terrorism Branch of the New Jersey Department of Human Services, Division of Mental Health and Addiction Services. With nearly 3 decades of frontline crisis response experience, Steve is deployed to the 1993 and 2001 World Trade Center attacks, as well as New Jersey's Anthrax Screening Center and other major disasters and acts of international terrorism. He serves as a consultant and instructor for multinational corporations, government agencies, major city police departments, and military programs, as well as an expert to the media and the courts in the area of violence prevention and intervention. So without further ado, I'll turn it right over to Steve.
Well, thank you very much, and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for making the time to join us today. The program's going to move pretty quickly, so please be making any notes or questions you have for us at the end of the program, and we'll have a time to handle a few different thoughts and questions. But I want to start right here on the cover slide, and 2 things of note. One is the title, Vehicular Active Assailant Attacks, and most of us today are certainly familiar with the concept of active shooter. The use of the terminology active assailant simply broadens the potential for different sorts of weapons, and certainly in this situation, vehicles are being used as a weapon. But what you'll see during this presentation is that by design, most vehicular attacks actually involve a number of weapons. They may involve edge weapons such as knives or axes, firearms, explosives, and so on, in addition to the vehicular attack. But the second thing I want to touch base on right here on the cover slide is simply the photograph, and this is not something staged. This isn't a Hollywood sort of set. This is actually a photograph taken in May of 2017 in Times Square in New York City. The attacker here, you see him charging forward after a vehicular strike. Richard Rojas, at the time, later claiming to be under the influence of PCP, also seemed to have some very severe mental health symptoms, experiencing voices commanding him to take action, and had told people later in the investigation that he had hoped to die by suicide by cop. 1 person was killed, a number of others were injured in this accident in lunch hour in Midtown Manhattan, and this photograph actually illustrates a few different key concepts for us right from the onset. And, that is when we think about these attacks using vehicles, they can and they do happen everywhere. They're not simply a phenomenon that we see in Europe. They're not a phenomenon we see exclusively to large cities. But this has been increasingly a low-tech and low-cost method of mass destruction. And a phrase I use often is the idea that this has become a tactic of choice for the homegrown violent extremists. So we're going to move at a pretty logical sort of pace through the program and touch on 3 major areas of concern. And the first is understanding the threat, understanding the hazard. Later in the program, we'll change directions, and our focus will be on understanding the defense to this specific threat. And our last call to action will be about really specifically action steps to take during an attack like this. I think we have done a good job. Unfortunately, it's been forced upon us to do a good job in the States in preparing for active shooter events. And most people you would talk to today probably have some concept of run, hide, fight, or some variant of that model that they would use at home, work, in the schools, or in the communities if they had an active shooter event. But I think far fewer people would have any meaningful sort of answer for you if you were to ask them what they would do during a vehicle attack. Well, it's an interesting thing that some of the very same dynamics involved in vehicle strikes are at play in active shooter events. There's a lot of overlap, both in the nature of the event and in terms of the motive of the attacker, but also in terms of the action steps that you and I could take to make ourselves, our friends, our family safe during an attack of this method. So I want to kind of spend the initial block of time on that, really making sure we understand the nature of the threat, how it's evolved, and where we are today with this specific sort of hazard. Back in May of 2017, the Transportation Security Administration issued a very thorough report titled Vehicle Ramming Attacks, the Threat Landscape Indicators and Countermeasures, and that report is still available online, of course, at no cost to you. And I'd recommend it really for all of us on the call today, even though it's really directed at the transportation sector. Some of the concepts that are outlined in the report really have broad applicability and really should be informative to all of us, regardless of what sectors we're operating in. But the two things really that jumped out of this report is, one, it really mentioned the significant uptick in the nature of this sort of attack. And this sort of attack is not necessarily new. Some of the first of these types dated back to the 1970s and maybe even before that. But in the last 3 years specifically, we've had a specific or a really, really significant spike in these sort of attacks. And the last time I did the math, going back into the spring, we had looked at 25 vehicle attacks that resulted in 214 deaths and almost 900 injuries worldwide. And that included the attack in Toronto on Sunday, April 22nd by Alec Manassian. And we're going to speak about that attack and some really unique features of that attack in just a few moments. But the other key point that comes out of the TSA guidance is really the bottom bullet here, that no community, regardless of its size, its location, the nature of the community, is immune from this sort of attack. It is just too easy. And because it is so easy and so accessible, we have every reason to believe that these sort of attacks are going to continue. Now, like active shooter attacks, these tend to be targeted at places where there is both a populated gathering of people, it's a populated venue, but also there's an element of confinement that people can't easily run from this. So when we think about the classic definition of an active shooter event, the Homeland Security definition really is that attack that happens in a populated and confined space. And you'll see throughout the program there's a lot of similarities, and that's one of the places where there's direct overlap. But I would recommend you to this guidance and to this report for some very specific sorts of thoughts about how we look at vehicles as a dual-purpose threat. When you think about dual-purpose threats, as an example, very often we think about someone who may be purchasing large amounts of fertilizer or large amounts of black powder that could be used, obviously, for their intended purpose, farming or fireworks, things like that, but obviously could be used to, as explosives as well. Well, it's interesting that now with this sort of attack method, we actually have to consider vehicles as a dual-purpose sort of purchase or rental when we have someone who seems to be accessing a vehicle for, some sort of suspicious reason. And we do have to be increasingly smart about this. So one of the things we see, as I said, is when we have a significant jump in the number of deaths and the number of injuries just over the last few years. And the chart goes on beyond this as it continues to be updated. Part of this very big spike you see there in this calendar from 2006 to 2016, a lot of that originates with one attack, and that's the attack in Nice, France on Bastille Day. That attack killed 86 people but injured another 430. And there's a lot of the elements of this attack are very characteristic of what we're going to refer to as the terrorist playbook for executing this specific sort of attack. And then we're going to go back to just about a year now. Last year on Halloween Day in Lower Manhattan, the attack of Seyfulo Saipov on the West Side Highway, killing 8 cyclists on the bike path and injuring nearly a dozen other people there as well. Those two events follow what we're going to refer to, as I said, as a specific script or playbook almost to the letter. And as we dive into that playbook a little later in the presentation, I want you to think about it as hopefully not just interesting, but also should be suggestive to us of pre-incident indicators of, pre-operational phases that may lend themselves to early detection and perhaps interdiction of preventing these sort of attacks. But a lot of the numbers, honestly, you could see, can be influenced even by a single attack, because although you and I have vehicles all around us almost every day, few people actually really consider just how catastrophic the damage can be done in a vehicle strike. The nature of the injuries are very, very substantial, and obviously the possibility for death as well. So when we look at this both nationally and internationally, we've seen a very, very substantial uptick, and it's really on our radar now as we start to think about really a transition, and a transition I recommend for all of us, away from simply preparing our organizations for active shooter events to preparing our organizations and communities for active assailant events that really envisions the possibility of multiple weapons platforms, including the possibility of vehicles or vehicles combined with other weapons as the method of attack. So we all recognize this. I know I'm preaching to the choir here. The nature of terrorism is to continually adapt to our countermeasures, and as we become perhaps smarter and more proficient at responding to active shooter events, well, the would-be attacker becomes more interested in novel attack formats and different ways, again, that perhaps we're not as well prepared for. Now, when we think about vehicle ramming attacks, they typically fall under a number of different categories when we think about the motive. When we think about the larger umbrella category that would encapsulate or capture all of the different motives, we refer to this concept of intentional vehicle attacks. And we know, and you'll see in just a moment, that there's a number of different motives, certainly several, but the three most popular are those that are conducted by someone who is substantially emotionally disturbed. There's some element of psychological or psychiatric disturbance or illness there that motivates the person. You're going to see that in a few cases in just a second. As I said, criminal intent, which is some other violent means, and this may be a personal grievance. It may be, we have seen this in smash and grab sorts of robberies, and certainly have seen this a few times in the along Fifth Avenue, the high wealth district of New York City, of people using vehicles to breach the front of jewelry stores for robberies. And then, of course, terrorism. And a lot of our work today in this brief session really will be focused on those acts that are motivated by terrorism. There's some sort of ideological or political motive for the act. Now, I used this phrase before, but I want you to understand when we think about radicalization and mobilization, just how powerful the propaganda tools of the major foreign terrorist organizations have become. And when I use that term, FTOs, or foreign terrorist organizations today in this concept, I'm primarily speaking about Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And many of you will be familiar with their major publications. The original ISIS publication, first called The Beak, later changing its name to Ramia, has published a series of very, very slick, very glossy issues of their magazine that have been, one, calls to action and recruitment tools, and two, very much instruction manuals for the would-be attacker. This is true of ISIS's magazine Inspire as well, but most of this writing has been done more recently by ISIS in Ramia. So you're going to see in our graphics here a number of different slides and photographs, and here a page taken right from Ramia and an article called Just Terror Tactics. And what you'll start to see in these magazines is not simply, as I said, a lot of, I guess, evoking emotion and stirring up the would-be attacker, motivating them for attack, but giving them very, very clear descriptions, and a phrase I've used once or twice already today is providing the playbook, which is the operational manual for how to conduct this sort of operation. And I'll spend some more time on that a little bit later in our program. But this sort of attack, just as all other sorts of terrorist attacks, have continued to evolve. And as I said, one of the things that has changed in terrorism in general is today both the U.S. Department of State and most of our state homeland security agencies see the threat of the homegrown violent extremist as the single greatest risk that we face. Not as much the sort of catastrophic terrorism that we saw on the morning of 9/11. Certainly we have adjusted our posture to that sort of a threat significantly. But the lone actor terrorist, and you'll see that we try not to use that term lone wolf for a number of reasons, but the lone actor here can pull off this sort of attack with very little training, very little funding, no specific sort of guidance or financing from the core terrorist group, but certainly the core terrorist group using very, very powerful propaganda, including social media, both to rally would-be instructors or attackers and actually to provide very good operational guidance to those attackers as well. One of the other things that's changed that's important for all of us to remember is as ISIS has lost territory on the battlefield, estimated between 97 and 93 and 97% of what they had previously held. They continue to call out to the homegrown violent extremists to execute acts wherever they are, whatever home countries that they reside in, and using, of course, whatever means they can as well. So let's take a step back to kind of understand the vehicular attack in the context of terrorism in general, because this is pretty interesting stuff, and it helps us understand the motive and also the method. Now, of course, everyone understands here that the most powerful tool of terrorism is actually fear. And the sort of fear that terrorists use is referred to as ambient fear. And ambient fear is the fear that's always operating in the background that another attack can happen at any minute. And that's kind of where we are today. Fear is a tremendous shaper of human behavior, but the most powerful variant of fear is when the threat is delivered on a random schedule, when you just don't know when it's going to happen, but you know for sure it's going to happen again. Now, when we start to think about the use of vehicles as a weapon of terror, vehicles actually play very, very well into the narrative of the terrorist, whether it's a larger terrorist organization or it's the lone actor. Because here, we obviously have vehicles in most communities all around us. And so if we're thinking, the attack method is knife or gun or some more traditional sort of weapon, there may be some comfort in whether it's true or just perceived that not everyone has a gun or a knife or would be prone to do this sort of thing. But certainly most people are around and might have access in one way or another to a vehicle. So when we think about the concept of ambient fear, introducing vehicles as weapons really, really plays well into that concept of ambient fear because vehicles are everywhere in our environment. Now, as I said, this is not necessarily a new threat. One of the very first on record was actually in Prague back in 1973. This is a really interesting case, as you'll see in a moment, because the motive here, and I would classify this individual as an emotionally disturbed person, was a woman driver. She had this perception really that she was a victim of society, that she was an outcast, a misfit, that she was being damaged by everyone's insensitivity to her, and she conducts this vehicle attack, and she had done a lot of writing about this and left messages to this effect. But I want to show you an interesting jump in logic where we go to April 22nd, this year, April 22nd, in Toronto, and on that morning, Alec Manassian drives a rented truck over through the sidewalk in the North York Center part of Toronto, a very busy sort of place. He kills 10, injures another 16, And he claims that he's doing this for an ideological reason, a social reason that, if you're not familiar, is referred to as incels. Incel, the term is a shorthand for involuntary celibate, and it goes back to a very, very interesting active shooter case of Elliot Rodger in Santa Barbara, California, several years ago. Rodger had seen himself as someone who was a victim, again, like a female driver in Prague, who was victimized by everyone else's insensitivity. This guy was having a really hard time connecting with everybody, but especially with the opposite sex. And he had gone on to write nearly a 140-page manifesto, really calling for incels, those who are struggling like he was, to strike out and attack what he referred to as the Chads and Stacys, the beautiful people of the world. And Manassian, right before he conducts this vehicle attack, posts online this military sort of statement, Private Manassian conducting this attack, and the incel rebellion has begun. Now, you might think of this as a one-off sort of situation, kind of quirky, but the Southern Poverty Law Center actually recognizes incels as a hate group, and while they're primarily online and primarily male, they do call for violence towards females and violence towards couples who seem to be, again, having an easy time of connecting with each other. But the weapon here in both of these instances, although they're kind of personal motives, and this one having somewhat of a social motive or ideological motive, the weapon here, again, being the vehicle. But as I mentioned, both in ISIS's publications and in Al-Qaeda's publications, increasingly instruction and a call to action to use vehicles as a weapon of mass destruction. If you could see this graphic, it's a cover shot of a Ford F-350 pickup truck. This is, again, a page from Rumia, the magazine from ISIS, and the headline, although it's a little blurry, says this is the ultimate mowing machine. And when they're talking in these articles, they're giving instructions about vehicle selection. What's the very best vehicle? And it's not just size or kind of the design, but it's things we might not think of. Hopefully, you and I wouldn't think of, such as turning radius, how quick its roll-on speed is. Going not from 0 to 60, but from 30 to 60, things of that nature. So they're looking at a lot of characteristics of these vehicles and trying to ascertain which are the most deadly. And then in the whole model of vehicular attack, especially terrorist vehicle attacks, is the idea of the secondary weapon. And this is important to all of us, especially if anyone on the call today is a first responder. Our tendency is, once a vehicle is stopped, we see this accident, we see the crash, is to want to run towards the vehicle to help if the driver or help victims. But one of the things we've learned is that when the vehicle stops for whatever reason, usually being crashed or stopped by police fire, the attack isn't over. The attacker has every intention of exiting the vehicle and continuing the attack, usually with, as I said, knife or firearm. And here in this graphic, again from Rumia magazine, instructions on what the best kind of knife is. And here you see a fixed blade as opposed to a folding blade, and giving instructions on what part of the body are the best targets for a knife attack. So as I mentioned, the online magazines, whether they're ISIS's or Al-Qaeda's, are very much online or distance learning sorts of platforms in providing very, very specific operational guidance in how to conduct these operations. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, the attack on Halloween Day in Lower Manhattan last year really followed this playbook very, very well. And we're going to do a review of that case in just a moment or two. But there you can see the attacker's vehicle was a rented Home Depot flatbed. Obviously, that's a very easy sort of weapon to access for most people, and it was for Saipov on that day. But I want to look at a few attacks and just really not so much dig into the specific case facts, but really to look at kind of where and how they happened. And we go back again, and I'm working backwards on the timeline here, from October to August 2017. And you may remember the larger attack in Barcelona that killed 13 in a very, very busy kind of tourist market area of the city. But a day later, a number of other people hit down the Spanish coast, and these being somewhat coordinated attacks. So, really the would-be attacker operating individually or as a small cell, understands that this is a very, very hard sort of threat to detect because, again, vehicles are everywhere, and simply owning, borrowing, renting, in some instances even stealing a vehicle may go unnoticed for several hours or several days, which gives the perpetrator time to execute this attack. Again, without looking at each attack, I want to point out a few things. When we look at the attack at Berlin Christmas market, there's a religious symbolism to that. When we looked a moment ago at the attack in Barcelona, in Nice, France, that was Bastille Day, Independence Day there, so obviously having a political significance as well. But other places that are popular tourist events like the Westminster Bridge or the London Bridge, or Queen Street in Stockholm, places, again, that are populated, confined, and also very often have a symbolic value. These become really the targets of choice for the vehicle attacker. The other thing here, again, focusing just on the headlines, are not all vehicle attacks occur in foreign countries, and this is a snapshot really of a vehicle attack at Ohio State. This is November 2016 on a busy day on campus. All 11 people who were hurt in this attack were actually hurt by the follow-on knife attack once the vehicle stopped and the attacker exited the vehicle. Again, it's a whole nother lesson plan for us to talk about radicalization and mobilization, but the attacker here, really claimed that this motivation was, from an Islamic radical standpoint, saying he had been inspired mostly by the teachings of Anwar al-Awlaki, one of the most, really ubiquitous and persuasive, I would suggest, online voices in the radical community. Not all vehicle attacks involve foreign terrorism, and somebody certainly will remember the vehicle attacks and the clashes between the white nationalist rally and the counter-protesters or Antifa in Charlottesville, Virginia. Attorney General Jeff Sessions had referred to that after the fact as a clear instance of domestic terrorism. So we see these vehicle attacks used in a number of different ways in a number of different places. And here's an instance, again, much like my cover photograph, of really where the motive seems to be emotional disturbance. And this gentleman driving last February his car into the emergency department of Middlesex Hospital in Connecticut, exiting the vehicle naked, setting himself on fire, having doused himself in gasoline, and the vehicle being filled with canisters of flammable liquid, really kind of ranting and raving all sorts of statements that would suggest, that he was psychotic and gravely mentally ill at the time of the attack. But here, the motive for the attack was one of emotional disturbance. So we see these happening for a number of different reasons, despite the fact that our focus is primarily on the terrorist event. When we go back to the nature of these events as terrorism, as I said, the vehicle attack plays very, very well into the narrative of the terrorist, because when we think about the nature of terrorism, the goal is really to create the maximum psychological, social, and economic damage. From a psychological standpoint, at the lowest level, people who may just feel vulnerable and anxious and edgy going to something like a parade or a market or a large outdoor sort of venue because they're hearing more about these sort of attacks and may feel somewhat vulnerable. If you are actually at this venue when there's an attack, obviously the potential for injury and death, and then also having witnessed this really creates, a significant psychologically traumatic event for people who may witness the graphic and gruesome nature of the attack. So it has very profound psychological impacts, and the bad guy understands that. The would-be attacker understands that. From the social impact, really what this does is also tears a community coherence. It tears at the fabric of a community because people may be hesitant to go to those larger symbolic events, something to celebrate a political or religious sort of holiday or an event, things that normally bring us together. Some individuals may actually now think twice about. And if that's happening, that obviously starts to erode community cohesion, but it also has the effect of when these attacks are successful, eroding our confidence in our security forces and law enforcement and so forth. And lastly, as a trickle-down effect, if people are not going, to these larger events out of fear, well, to those hotels and those vendors on the street and everyone else who would have had a financial stake in these large events, the lack of revenue and the fact that people are curtailing their attendance, curtailing their spending, starts to have an economic effect as well. Now, I mentioned a few moments ago that there's a significant overlap, and we could do a lot more with this graph, but there's a significant overlap between active shooter and vehicle attacks. And as I said, there's a number of different motives when we look at the vehicle attack, certainly ideological when it's terrorist, but also we mentioned the criminal intent and the emotional disturbance. When we think about victim selection, that's where it really starts to become more apparent that most victims in vehicle attacks also seem to be randomly selected, and that's true in most active shooter events. Venue selections identical, populated and confined spaces, the objectives are maximum casualties, and in many instances there's a fairly extended planning curve, but I do want to point out that obviously the time frame between flash and bang, really between the decision to move and the actual action, can be very, very short in the vehicle attack because while most people, may not have easy access to a firearm to conduct an active shooter attack, most people can access, if they don't outright own, can access a vehicle pretty quickly. So when we think about who would be the active shooter, also as a parallel, very often we speak about that person, not necessarily who's just a loner, but who's the incompetent joiner, the person who feels as a misfit, ostracized, difficult finding their place, a person who's a seeker, an acceptance seeker, and so forth, really can be attracted to and feel victimized and motivated towards these sort of attacks for a number of different reasons, a number that have commonalities. But when we think about the path to radicalization, the one thing I did want to point out, and this slide itself is a lesson plan just by itself, is if we move from left to right and we think about motivation, it's the person who accepts, and usually through online radicalization, really that they're starting to be introduced to a more radical belief system. And remember this, radicalization is a shift in opinion and mobilization is a shift in action. So the story goes like this very quickly. Someone is looking in a number of different places and is introduced to a radical sort of ideology. Part of the ideology says to them, if you are a real believer in the ideology, real believers don't sit on their hands, they take action. And not only do they accept the ideology, but a small subset understand that if you accept the ideology, you have to act on it. So part of the indoctrination is now starting this, pre-operational phase of thinking, planning, and moving towards an operation. And the last phase, the terrorism and action phase, is someone who actually moves from the pre-operational to operational phase. But this is true of all forms of terrorism. It's true very often in active shooter events as well. But the reason I bring that up is a basic understanding of this cycle says really to all of us in, our different disciplines that there are opportunities for detection once we have an idea of what this looks like, how people move through this pre-operational cycle, how they move from radicalization to mobilization. So I want to talk a little more about this. These are the 8 tactical steps that are identified by ISIS in Romania in the playbook that I mentioned. And they've also mentioned it in a number of cases that were very, very sort of informative and instructional, such as Nice, France, and the one on Halloween Day last year. Every one of these steps practically was followed to the letter. So let's talk a little bit about what they mean and where we vary on one or two of these. The very first step, as you'd imagine, is target acquisition, and that is the where. Obviously, populated and confined spaces we spoke about, but we're also looking for places that have a symbolic value, places where there's, we mentioned the largest numbers of people. Maybe it's events that are likely to be televised as well, that have a national significance. So target acquisition really slices a number of different ways when we think about how the attacker would select the venue, select it, and really a place, conduct the operation. Moving from there really then is the timing of it. What's the very best time? So let's use Bastille Day here in Nice as an example, and it's not only Bastille Day having this political symbolism, but what time? Because the attacker understood that people were on the beach watching a fireworks display and timed the attack to occur just as the fireworks ended and people were walking from the beach across the streets back to their vehicles, back to their homes. So the street would most likely be at its maximum density in terms of crowd at that specific time. So the attacker is thinking the where, then they're thinking about the when, and then they're thinking about the how. And this is vehicle selection and vehicle acquisition. And we've seen this from from small passenger cars to larger commercial sorts of trucks. In this case, which was the Berlin Christmas market, this vehicle was actually hijacked, and the driver was killed by the attacker, and they used this large commercial vehicle to drive into a crowd at the Christmas festival. Obviously, religious symbolism involved here as well. So the next thought for the attacker is, how do I get the vehicle, and what kind of vehicle do I get? One example of an insider threat, I want to flip back for 1 second here to, really the how we get the vehicle, is instructions have been given very, very clearly in RMIA and other publications that really however you acquire the vehicle is fine. And that's buying it, renting it, owning it, taking it by force, which is hijacking, or just borrowing it from a friend or family member or someone else to conduct the attack, regardless of what kind of vehicle it is. But you see here in the graphic the optimal kind of vehicle or best vehicles. But I wanted to mention the insider attack, and this is an interesting case. This fellow here, Jameson, had recently finished his obligations, finished his service as a Marine, and over time started to really flip in terms of his mindset and started to take on the mindset of the extremist. And he takes a job specifically at a tow truck company, so he would have access to a very large, heavy, and destructive sort of vehicle. He is talking to people, he believes, or sympathizers to his beliefs about this. And he's told an undercover FBI agent that, he has the vehicle, he has access to the vehicle, and he is actually thinking and planning about conducting an attack over the Christmas holiday last year on Pier 39 in San Francisco, which obviously is typically busy, but very busy during the holidays. And this situation obviously was stopped by law enforcement and our intelligence community, but it's a good example of the insider threat of someone who has access to that large, heavy sort of vehicle as part of their job. Now, one thing we should always assume in a vehicular attack is the possibility of secondary weapons. And here again on the cover of RMIA, you see this kind of bloodied knife blade, but both ISIS and Al-Qaeda have called for the use of a secondary weapon to continue the attack and, really maximize the casualties, but also prolong the media exposure and coverage of the event, and to ensure martyrdom, because in this mindset, the attack truly is not a success unless the attacker is killed, and it's a martyrdom operation. Now, there is another element of the playbook we have not seen used against civilian targets. We've seen this in conflict zones, and we've seen this in military sorts of environments, and that is vehicle modification, which typically means what we'll call up-armoring or plating the vehicle. And this is welding heavier steel plates to it. That does two things. One is it makes it that much more of a destructive vehicle in terms of impact, but also keeps the driver in the game a lot longer if security forces or law enforcement are returning fire or firing at the vehicle. We have not seen this in the application or the targeting of civilian targets yet. We've only seen it, as I said, but the literature does call for this sort of action. The next of the steps is allegiance, and allegiance we'll see is leaving messages, leaving flags, leaving writing, and also the sort of statements that someone would make when they're leaving their vehicle to make it very, very clear to everyone in the environment that they've conducted this sort of attack in the name of one of the major foreign terrorist groups. Along with this, very interesting, is RMIA has instructed that in the writing or the screaming out of a different phrase as we're exiting the vehicle, the statement, the Islamic State will remain. So again, thinking that ISIS has lost so much physical territory that they really would like everyone to have this sense that the caliphate, that the Islamic State is still viable, even though they're not necessarily holding territory. And the last of these is martyrdom. And martyrdom, obviously, is the idea that the attacker is going to give his or her life in the attack. This is a photograph of Sayfullah Saipov, the attacker on Halloween Day in Lower Manhattan. His original attack plan was to drive this rented Home Depot truck to the base of the Brooklyn Bridge, where he would plow into a larger crowd. But he didn't make it that far. He crashed into a school bus, actually with kids and adults on board. But he exits the vehicle. He has two handguns. One's like a paintball gun, and the other is essentially like an airsoft or a pellet gun. Neither are viable guns. But he didn't intend to shoot or kill anybody with the guns. He pulled out those weapons really to attract return fire from the police and die in that action. He was shot in the abdomen. He was taken into custody. He lived through this attack. And interesting enough, in the next days, in ISIS's publications, they said in a very general way that a brother of the Islamic State had conducted this attack but refused to use Saipov's name. And in other instances, if the attacker hasn't died, ISIS or Al-Qaeda sometimes have refused to even claim responsibility for the attack. So the attack is meant to be a martyrdom operation. Now, that should be interesting to us in detection, but also as first responders, that we know that once the vehicle stops, the attack isn't over. The attacker is likely to get out and continue the attack, and we also know that they're going to continue the attack until death. That's by design. That should be informative to us, and that's messages we should share with our fellow first responders. So in our last phase today, maybe the last 5 or 10 minutes, let's talk a little bit about the defense and some actions we could take. And I often ask people this hypothetical question, think about yourself being out on a really nice fall weekend day. It's Saturday, Sunday, with friends or family who've come to visit you. You're taken to a popular place where there's a nice outdoor activity. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you hear tires shrieking and engines revving and people screaming and running. And it becomes clear to you there's a vehicle attack in progress. What would you do? It is my experience that when I ask that question to audiences, very few people have a meaningful answer other than, run. So let's talk a little bit about that, because when we think about the concept of active assailant and we look at the statistical uptick in this sort of attack, I think this is the time we really need to be speaking to the public and our constituents about how to recognize and how to respond to a vehicular attack as well as a firearms attack, something like an active shooter. So the same things that make outdoor events, big popular outdoor events, fun, they make them attractive targets to the would-be terrorist. And we have to keep that in mind. And as such, it's important that all of us have some sort of plan in mind about what we would do. Now, security everywhere, from the building you're sitting in right now to everywhere we go out in the public spaces, it works best as a two-factor sort of solution. One is security stuff. And when we think about vehicle attacks, that may be like barriers and bollards and other sorts of mechanisms or physical apparatus, but it also really involves a number of different security behaviors, and that's things that you and I can or should do that could actually reduce the likelihood of attack. Now, I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time on it. Probably most of us are familiar with what we call passive inoperable defense measures like fencing and barriers that are meant to protect us from a ramming strike. And when I talk about vehicles here, this is something you may see, for example, on a parade day in a major city where public works trucks have been filled with sand or gravel or block and parked on side streets to really as a barrier to prevent a vehicle from making a speedy entrance onto a side street, entering the parade route, and hurting or killing anyone. So these are all kind of very common and very obvious defense measures. And some are very high-tech, where they're hydraulic, that they raise these very significant barriers or bollards. Some are very low-tech. They can be things like heavy planters that are more decorative that, again, prevent a ramming attack. But I wanted to talk about just 2 or 3 very quickly that are kind of novel. Some of these are primarily in Europe at the moment. In the attack on the Christmas market in Berlin, authorities told us after the fact that they think that actually the attack would have been worse and many more people would have died, except the truck that was kidnapped or hijacked, you have to remember, the attacker probably didn't recognize that that truck had an automatic braking system. And in Europe, trucks that are carrying certain materials or certain sizes are mandated to have this sort of braking system. And once it made its first contact, the brakes locked up and the truck skidded. It caused more damage, but it would have been much worse if this vehicle didn't have automatic braking. The other thing that's kind of in the works in the UK is a technology called Restore, and that's a remote stop and kill switch. And what this does is it's actually a line of code written into the vehicle's computer system that will shut down the fuel pump, shut down the fuel system, and the vehicle will stall out within seconds. This is being used primarily on vehicles that are carrying hazmats and other large or dangerous objects on the roads today, but it can be, and it's being thought about being introduced to many other sorts of trucks and cars as well. And the last of these is something a little more familiar to most of us, and some of us have seen the road spikes that law enforcement will use to stop a vehicle. This product called Talon is a spiked webbed mesh that can be deployed by 2 officers in less than 1 minute to cover the roadway, wraps itself around the wheels, stops the vehicles. But one of the neat things about it is it stops the vehicles without the vehicle going into a skid. So it stops it in a straight line and kind of minimizes some of the impact. But the other thing that's important, besides knowing that these technologies are out there and increasingly being deployed, are the things we could do. And I'm just going to introduce a few of these ideas, and that would be, to think for ourselves and share with our friends and family different ways we make ourselves safe. And we think about the idea of situational awareness. And to me, situational awareness always means looking for the 2 R's, risks and resources. Risk, what may hurt me, resources, what may help me. So when we think about that, if I'm going to a parade, I don't want to stand at curb line. Most people who are hurt and killed in vehicle attacks are those closest to the actual roadway, so I want to be back a little bit. And I'd rather be at a street corner than in the middle of the block. What we know in vehicle attacks is the vehicle driver wants to build up speed and momentum. He, typically a male, will swerve to try to maximize impact with pedestrians, but we don't have any examples of people really stopping, slowing, or turning the vehicle, making a hard right or left. So if I'm on a side street and I have a place to fall back, that creates a safe escape route for myself and the people who are with me. I want to be vigilant and stay away from temporary structures like bleachers and platforms and stages that people are trying to escape a vehicle attack tend to climb onto high objects under the weight of the crowd. If that collapses, the people on it, under it, and around it obviously will be hurt as well. During the event, as I said, if there are security measures, bollards, planters, other sorts of barriers, use them. If it's been obvious that the police have set out different sorts of barriers, they're for our safety. They shouldn't be seen as an inconvenience. We should use those and use them for our safety. And as we go into the environment, keep our heads up. Really be attentive to the environment, to people's behavior, and looking out for a vehicle that may be erratically moving, or if a crowd starts really rushing towards us. So there's a number of things we could do, and obviously we can go more into that, and you can find more about that online as well. But my final notes really are, once the vehicle is stopped, don't be a hero. Remember that it's very likely that the attacker is going to get out and continue the attack. There may be more than one attacker. The vehicle may have other sorts of hazards on board, such as IEDs or other hazmats. So make your safety, your first family's safety a priority, moving away from that situation until you otherwise, determine that you can safely help others. And make sure you have the skills and knowledge. So when I look at this slide very quickly, it starts to talk about the current FEMA campaign, Until Help Arrives, which is about bleeding control and hemorrhaging control. If you're not familiar, this is an every person skill set, and just as the major way that people die in active shooting events is by bleeding out, the major way people die in vehicular attacks is similar to bleeding out. So knowing how to use gauze, tourniquet, pressure, and other means to stop massive bleeding will be critical. And remember, we are always the very, very first responders. So know what to do before, know what to do after. Think about how we're going to provide immediate medical support and emotional support to those around us, perhaps with the use of basic concepts like psychological first aid. But keep our heads up. Understand this is a real risk. It is an increasingly popular form of attack, low cost, low-tech, and because of all those elements, very likely that we have not seen the last of this sort of attack. So I'm going to wrap it up, and we'll be ready for questions, comments, and so forth. I do have a number of articles you can find out there online that go into these concepts a lot further, including last fall's issue of the Journal of Counterterrorism, a full-length article called Hell on Wheels. So I'll wrap it up there. You can reach me through the New Jersey Disaster and Terrorism Branch, and I'll turn it back over to our moderators.
Steve, thanks so much for that great presentation. Folks, we have time for a few questions, so if anyone would like to send me a question through the Q&A pod, please do. All right, so it doesn't look like we have any questions at this time. Again, I just want to thank everyone for joining this webinar. Steve, again, that was a really great presentation, and we will be opening up that poll if folks can stay on. Thank you.